Yeah, we did see in that Redfern statement video there was some reference there to a number of the challenges. Trauma was one of the things that was mentioned as an experience of many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which is, I guess, a theme we're going to pick up with our next speaker, Dr. Howard Barth. And it's my great pleasure to now welcome Dr. Barth, who will be sharing with us on the place of the trauma framework in child and family services. Dr. Barth has had a long career working with children and young people in the child welfare, youth justice and mental health systems. He was a youth worker and house parent, then trained as a clinical psychologist before becoming regional director for Barnardo's in the ACT. After completing a doctorate at the University of Washington, he returned to Australia to manage a child and family services agency, Marymead Child and Family Services, in the 1990s. Then he established the Thomas Wright Institute to provide direct clinical training and program evaluation services across Australia. For 6.5 years, from 2008 to 2015, Howard was the inaugural Children's Commissioner in the Northern Territory, with a mission to ensure the wellbeing of vulnerable children and their families in government-administered or funded services. In that context, he was co-chair of an inquiry into the child protection system in the Northern Territory, the report from which provided a roadmap for the redevelopment of services in that jurisdiction. Through Alambi Care, he currently provides a range of consultancy and training services across Australia and internationally, focusing on the impacts of severe adversity, interventions that promote healing and growth, and the processes of organisational change. Howard has authored numerous professional papers and reports on child protection, out-of-home care, family preservation and developmental trauma. He is co-author with John Seater, have I pronounced that correctly, of the recently published book, The 3 Pillars of Transforming Care, Trauma and Resilience in the Other 23 Hours, and that's in 2018. Howard also presented a fantastic pre-conference workshop titled What It Really Matters to Be Trauma-Informed, that many of those who were here in attendance participated in yesterday. And thank you, Howard, for that workshop yesterday. So now could you please join me in welcoming Dr. Howard Barth to the stage. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Michael, for your welcome, and greatly appreciate the invitation from Family and Relationship Services Australia to present here this morning. It's a great honour. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, the leaders, the past and present and emerging, and also other Aboriginal people here in this room today. Today I want to explore the place of the trauma framework in child and family services. It's the first time that I've actually looked at this issue taking a step back, because usually I'm really focused on trying to explain the trauma framework rather than to look at its place in service delivery. I want to explore the remarkable rise of this perspective, but also some of the challenges and controversies that have come along with it, to touch on the central or core propositions, and then just how the trauma framework should fit. So it's a lot to get through. But it is remarkable, isn't it, that we should be talking about one particular theoretical framework when there are so many other competing theories, a few with arguably more compelling research evidence to back them. And just to clarify my perspective from up front, my background is in a range of child protection related services like foster care, residential care, family support and family preservation. For my sins, I've also run a daycare service as part of that, and also more recently around research and regulatory work. Although this colours what I'm going to say today, and my examples are from that field, I believe that the trauma framework can be applied, of course, to a whole range of services and a whole range of challenges. So isn't it remarkable how this framework has emerged in the last few years? Not long ago, I looked at a survey done of professional staff from a large Sydney agency. There were about 30 staff that did this survey, and the survey was about the theoretical models or the theoretically based interventions that drove their work. And from that survey, they determined the top 10 theoretical models that were influencing that particular agency. You wouldn't be surprised at some of those frameworks. For instance, solution-focused therapy was there. Attachment theory, reality therapy, narrative therapy. Don't hear so much about that, but it certainly was very, very prominent a few years ago. CBT, strength-based approaches, choice theory, and a few others. But what was remarkable to me was what wasn't there in that list. Just over 10 years ago, there was not a mention of trauma. It's not that it wasn't around, it's just that it hadn't penetrated into most human services. It was around, of course, in mental health and counselling services, but it hadn't penetrated yet. Today, trauma theory would undoubtedly be at the top of that list. There are numerous conferences and seminars with trauma as a theme, or at least as a significant theme, just like this one. Have you been to a conference in recent years where trauma hasn't been a theme? There are books, there are papers, there are tours by the gurus of trauma, there are organisational models of trauma. Everyone wants to be, and indeed is even required to be these days, trauma-informed. There's trauma-informed care, there's trauma-informed classrooms, trauma-informed youth justice services, even trauma-informed daycare. You may have detected a little bit of ambivalence in what I'm saying about trauma, and yes, there is. And it's because things have a tendency, I think, in the initial rush of enthusiasm to get a little bit unbalanced. It's not the fault of the perspective itself, but rather, I think, the unbridled enthusiasm of some of the advocates. In child welfare, for example, you could argue that the trauma perspective has hijacked the very meaning of the word therapeutic. This is the definition of therapeutic care from the New South Wales Out-of-Home Care Agency. So you can see, therapeutic care is a growing field of research and practice that embeds the latest developments from trauma theory, child brain development and attachment theory into service delivery. So to be therapeutic is to have adopted a particular understanding of the impact of trauma on the brain, on brain behaviour and development, and to see human problems through this lens, to intervene using strategies that fit with this, and using insights that fit with this perspective. So attachment theory is still there, but it seems to be rapidly becoming a secondary consideration, a supportive perspective. It's as if all the previous research on therapeutic change is going out the window. What about behavioural theory, learning theory, CBT, solution-focused approaches, psychodynamic approaches? Are they now out because being therapeutic is understood as being informed about trauma? I've been to some events, you might have also, where the trauma perspective seems to have assumed an almost quasi-religious tone. It provides, as if it provides a missing piece to the therapeutic conundrum. Some wag recently suggested that all this emphasis on the brain has led to a sort of neuromania. And there are books about pushback books now, for instance, that book Blinded by Neuroscience recently, suggesting that we've adopted this thing in fact too rapidly. It could equally be said, I would suggest, that the emphasis on trauma in some areas has led to a sort of traumania as well. Having worked with a number of theoretical perspectives over 40 years, I believe the trauma perspective is a compelling one, even revolutionary in its implications, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not the solution to all or even most of our struggles in human services. Bettelheim once told us that love is not enough. Some of us oldies remember that. And as important as it is, I come from the perspective that being trauma-informed also is not enough. There are a number of other difficulties. I'm going to start with the difficulties and move on to the strengths, if that's okay, in terms of how the trauma framework fits. There are a number of other difficulties with the framework. For example, there is some muddiness about what actually we're talking about. What is trauma? Is it actually what happens to you? Is it what happens? Is it the event or the events? Or is it the impact of those events? The writers just seem to swing between the two. Most people agree that it seems to involve extreme terror and helplessness, the experience of trauma. And yet the term is also applied to many other common developmental adversities like neglect, which of course does not generally involve terror, but grinding cumulative experiences of seriously deficient care. Things like a lack of food, attention, supervision, comfort, medical care, leading to the perceptions in the people involved that they are of little significance and others can't be trusted. In fact, the actuarial research on neglect would suggest that the developmental outlook for kids that have experienced it is on the whole worse than for many who have experienced one-off experiences of trauma. Now, that's not to say that for individuals that always applies, but if we look actuarially as a group of those neglected. So other forms of adversity can also derail normal development, just like traumas do. We need to be clear about what adversities we're talking about, and they're not all traumas. If we focus on the research findings, there's as much warrant for us to be informed about the impacts of chronic and cumulative stress in development as there is, in my view, about trauma per se. And of course, even focusing on trauma, we can be talking about very diverse phenomena, from a one-off overwhelming event through to abnormal traumatizing events over a period of time, right through to complex and chronic adversities in childhood, which of course are referred to these days as complex or developmental trauma. And then there's intergenerational traumas, there's historic trauma, and we've heard about some of that this morning, where the implicit memories, the stories of previous generations get relived in the present. In other words, trauma is a multidimensional, incredibly complex construct, and we need to be very careful about what we're actually referring to when we talk about trauma or the trauma framework. And then there's the term traumatized itself. Most of my work is with children and teenagers. There's no doubt, in my view, that the word trauma or traumatized is better than many others that have been used in the past. For instance, most of them are pejorative, blaming or shaming words or descriptors that are used about many of the kids, for instance, in out-of-home care. Delinquent, troubled, feral, out of control, attention-seeking, disturbed, and you know the list goes on. And there are code words for hopeless case, like borderline personality disorder. Traumatized does draw attention to what has happened, but it can also suggest victim and being helpless, someone who cannot manage themselves. In other words, it can become stigmatizing in the same way that other labels can become stigmatizing for young people. Some years ago, I remember doing a counselling session with a teenage girl in foster care. She was about 13. I'll call her Mandy. She was in a shaky foster care placement. She had been referred because she was running away, hanging around with older guys down in the town centre, smoking, drinking, and generally being defiant in care. At one point, I did what you shouldn't do, and I asked her, "Do you know why you're doing these things, Mandy?" She immediately shot back at me, "Yes, I do. I've got ODD." She went on to earnestly tell me about the doctor who diagnosed her and what this condition means. For Mandy, it seemed that the label ODD had become a passport to do what she liked. It was the justification. It confirmed that she was helpless and out of control because she now had this label. I'm concerned that the label trauma or traumatized can likewise carry risks for the people we apply them to. I've been alarmed to hear some workers glibly refer to kids in care as traumatized kids, as if that defines them and it captures the essence of who they are. But there's another major challenge with the trauma label. It may be accurate to note that someone's experienced trauma, but it fundamentally represents, doesn't it, a focus on deficit and dysfunction, on what has gone wrong, what is different, what sets this person apart, what needs fixing. Many clients of our service, especially young people in our care systems, are acutely aware that they feel like outsiders anyway, that they are different to their peers in a less than sense, unfortunately often feel that they're abnormal or defective in some way. And those in out-of-home care, for instance, don't live with their natural parents, probably don't live in their original communities, have to get new friends all the time, may attend special schools. Everything about their lives suggests it's abnormal. They're acutely aware of being abnormal, and the associated emotion is shame. I'll just put this, came across this in a coffee shop not long ago. So normal is boring. In mainstream society, we value uniqueness, don't we? People that are distinctive, the trailblazers, and we fear being mainly normal. I guess this little sign is a reflection of that anxiety about being normal. But James Anglin, one of the researchers in out-of-home care in Canada, found that when he spent time with kids, two themes came up, kids in care. Two themes came up. One was emotional pain, and the second was the quest to be normal, the need to feel that you're normal. This is kids in out-of-home care. Here's some quotes from kids that have been in care. So one says, once I began to realise what normal people do and compare myself to them, I learned to lie to myself about what I was. In other words, I had to create a false sense to try and be like the others. Another one says, everyone wants to be normal, whatever that means. One says, I felt really different to the other kids. I felt like a freak at times. This is John Sita, the co-author of the book that I've been working on for out-of-home care. It has a remarkable story. He spent most of his childhood in out-of-home care, in foster care, and 7 years in residential treatment. So he has a lot to reflect on and tell us about his experiences. Here's John reflecting on his time in residential care, comparing himself to his friends at school. Here's what he said. He says, I always felt different. Not good different, not unique different in a positive way, not proud different as in marching to my own drum, but shameful different. I felt as if I was somehow less in nearly every way than my peers. So many people, young people, are acutely aware of what marks them out as different, abnormal, not good enough. The quest for normality is a quest to escape the shame of feeling different in a less than sense. And in many ways, because to be normal is your passport to belonging. To carry the label traumatized, or even to be in treatment and therapy, can suggest that you are not normal. This brings me to the issue of what we need to be focusing on in our services, fixing what's gone wrong on healthy normative growth or on healthy normative growth. And what is the place of treatment and therapy? Just recently I went to a conference on treatment, and they were talking about residential care. Someone made this statement that the purpose of care, this is residential care and foster care, is the healing of trauma. Now, I think it sounds good, but I think it's fundamentally wrong. Because trauma is just one of the multiple sort of adversities that our young people have to deal with growing up. John Cedar helped me understand this concept. In the course of working with him on our recent work, he was reflecting on his 7 years in placement. I asked John what helped him the most in terms of the treatment and the programs that he went to. And he said, it wasn't the formal treatment, it wasn't the counselling sessions, it wasn't the group work. He said this, it was the normal activities of growing up. It was when I was able to hang out with my friends after school, when I was able to go with my girlfriend to the pizza parlour, when the staff took me and taught me how to drive, when I joined the basketball team in the local community, and when he was gradually able to connect with his youth workers over time. None of these could be considered formal treatment or therapy. They're not the treatments we think of, but for him they were the treatments he needed. They were the oxygen, the developmental oxygen he needed. It's not that specific therapies aren't helpful. Yes, we know that, but they should not be the first priority in our work, and they're not always the most useful. For John, they weren't the most useful things. For him, the sense that he was normal and engaging in normal activities was powerful. And just one final gripe before I move to the more positive stuff. Most of those engaged in frontline service, those with clients with developmental trauma, I'm thinking of the foster carers, the teachers, residential workers, youth justice workers and others, those that day-to-day work in the life space, tend not to be those with the highest level of training and experience in working with people with traumatic backgrounds. They have to contend with a field of practice that's becoming increasingly specialised, like most fields of practice. Interesting observation from Carol Goodhart, recent president of the American Psychological Association. She tells us that much of the research that guides practice, evidence-based practice, is far too inaccessible, overwhelming, and removed from practice. Good authority, that one. I came across this gem recently as I was doing some research on child development and the impact of trauma in terms of the obtuse language that's often used in publications these days. So I had to read this 3 or 4 times before I could figure out what they were saying. But maltreated treatment, Cicchetti tells us, traverse a probabilistic pathway characterised by an increased likelihood for a compromised resolution of stage-salient developmental tasks. Does anyone know what that means? Well, I suspect it means that trauma can compromise developmental progress or something like that. But the literature does not help us, and particularly does not help people at the front line of service. So despite these misgivings about the way the trauma framework is being promoted, I do speak as one of the converted. I accept the notion that it provides a compelling explanatory framework for many individual and societal ills. The research on the impacts of severe adversity in brain development and adverse life outcomes is truly compelling. We've long known that disorder and dysfunction can be the result of many things: choices, temperament, genetics, epigenetics, learning principles, reinforcement modelling, and I could go on and on and on. What does trauma add to that? Well, I think it just emphasises the role of external agents in causing problematic changes and developmental problems. Here's Sandra Bloom. She said that trauma theory proposes that the origin of a significant proportion, not all, of physical, social and moral disorder lies in the exposure to external traumatic agents. Felitti and Ander, who were the researchers in the most cited body of research in human services in the last 2 decades, that's the ACE, what's commonly known as the ACE studies, found that there were 10 relatively common adversities or traumas that a middle-class sample can face. And I'll just go very quickly through that. They came up with 8, and then they added another 2, 10. These are not the only adversities people face, but they are common adversities. You will note, though, if you look at those adversities, that only 3 or 4 might be considered traumas in the commonly understood sense of the word. The others refer to chronic conditions, chronically stressful and adverse conditions. What they did find, of course, was a remarkable correlation between the sheer number of exposures and later adverse outcomes. Here we've got lifetime alcoholism, and you can see that people with none of these stresses in their early lives had a risk of just over 2%, but when you get up to 4 or more, it's 8 times the risk. The risk increases dramatically as the number of stress points from childhood increases. You can see also that we see the same pattern with clinical depression. This is clinical depression in this particular one. You can see it's slightly different, the impacts over time for males and females. You can see also that about 18% of females in this sample experienced clinical depression in the absence of obvious childhood stresses, but that there was indeed a very strong relationship between that early stress and later outcomes. And that indeed this research, using the PAR statistic, population attributable risk, has suggested this, that if we could eliminate sources of stress for children, and they all are potentially subject to change, there would be a dramatic drop in halving of drug use, illicit drug use. There would be a very dramatic drop in IV drug use. There would be a halving in current depression, a 2/3 reduction in alcoholism, and also in suicide attempts. And this is just some of the research. Of course, it's replicated in many countries today. That is behind the reason that we're here talking about trauma today. One of the implications that we've all picked up from, Sandra Bloom is accredited with this, but she doesn't own it, the idea that it's shifted the focus from diagnostic criteria and things that have gone wrong to actually trying to understand what actually happened here, what happened to lead to this. I don't have time to delve into all the research, and of course there was a lot of research on brain development and the impact on the brain of trauma. I'm not going to get into that, but we do know that some of that harm can be reversed with appropriate support and appropriate interventions. More of it, others of it, might be resistant to change. Here is just a summary of one of the other reasons we're here talking about trauma today. This is a compilation of the research on the outcomes of exposure to trauma. The developmental domains that are affected. According to Cook and her colleagues, attachment schemas are affected, social skills, physical health, control of emotions and impulses, controls of behaviour, thinking skills, self-concept, shame and guilt, hopes for the future are all developmental domains and ways of thinking that are affected by exposure to complex forms of trauma. Here's what Felitti and Ander say, that these findings, and I've only just skated over them, both of impact on the brain and of developmental outcomes, provide a credible basis for a new paradigm. And that's what we're talking about, isn't it? The trauma framework, the new paradigm of medical, public health and social services practice. So I'd just like to look at very quickly a couple of those implications, because from that large body of research, we can extract some key propositions. And I believe in work with kids in out-of-home care, there are 3 key propositions. If you're working with some adult survivors of abuse, there might be 4, but it really depends on what you interpret as being most relevant for your particular clients. But I'll whiz through these. There are 4 key propositions, in my view, that come out of this research that need to be interpreted for your particular program. I think the first is this. This is Bruce Perry, suggesting that traumatized people reset their normal level of arousal where no external threats exist. They're in a persistent state of alarm, and that seems to be the most consistent outcome of the impact of trauma on the developing child, and of course that the impacts of that go right through to adulthood. In fact, there's research on stress hormone levels. There's research on the brain scans on the amygdala functioning, for instance, and the immune functions all point to this issue that people may appear calm, but actually don't feel calm. And of course, when we're feeling anxious, that governs our thinking and it governs our behaviour. According to Porges, we've got to be careful about this, because just being safe doesn't mean someone is going to feel safe. But the first priority is the priority of the need to feel safe. Let's just move on to the second one here. This is Van der Kolk suggesting that the essence of trauma is feeling God-forsaken and cut off from the human race. In other words, he's suggesting it's an experience we have alone. Peter Fonagy at the recent conference in Melbourne said this, that adversity becomes trauma when it's compounded with an understanding that the mind is alone. It's something that we have to go through alone. However, we do know that resilience has to do with reconnecting and connections. And so that's the second imperative, the imperative of making positive human connections. The connections, I believe, are to do with people that we can trust. They're to do with normal community groups and activities, and they're also with culture. For some kids that have become disconnected, that need in terms of identity formation and vision comes from that reconnection with their sense of self, their identity with culture. The third one is this, this is Cozzolino. He said that the traumatized individual is drowning in a sea of fragmented and overwhelming emotions and frightening thoughts. So the issue is, how are they coping with that? What's actually happening in terms of them? We know that a lot of that coping is maladaptive and problematic coping. So the imperative is, how can we assist that person to adapt and cope adaptively and positively? Here's Van der Kolk. He says the first priority is usually not therapy with our people who have experienced trauma, but actually helping them cope in the here and now. And in my view, that's the third key imperative. Learning how to gain mastery over one's internal sensations and thoughts. I've added one more because this comes up in the literature quite frequently when we're working with older clients, and that's this issue of empowerment. Sandra Bloom says people who are traumatized appear to lose all or some of their capacity to choose their course of action. Reflected in Van der Kolk's work too, trauma robs you of the feeling that you're in charge of yourself. So this idea of autonomy, of independence, of empowerment, of choice becomes more and more relevant as your client group gets older. So there are the four key imperatives, I believe, that come out of the whole trauma framework. And just to sum up, that you don't need always to be a specialist or a therapist to be able to address these particular needs with clients. Certainly, clinicians have a key role in working with clients and guiding work, but you don't have to be formally qualified to actually address most of these needs with clients. One point I want to make here, and I'm just going to skate over this, is that I don't believe one size fits all with the trauma framework. It has to be interpreted for each particular client group and each particular service. Yes, there are shared propositions and shared ideas, but it essentially has to be tailored for the particular group that you're working with. So when we're working with kids in out-of-home care, there are a number of imperatives that will be different than if we're working, say, in a domestic violence shelter, even though there's overlap in terms of the concepts. Lastly, I just want to look at the place of trauma-informed practice alongside other imperatives. And I speak here from the perspective of out-of-home care, but that can be adapted conceptually, I think, to any particular service. Many services that I go to these days want to talk about traumagenic needs. You know, what are the needs of our clients that are related to trauma? We could call them trauma-related needs. And I've been talking about those today. In fact, those four imperatives that I had up were to do with trauma-related or traumagenic needs. Needs that are different to people that haven't experienced trauma. But there's a problem, as I said, I've already pointed this out, that there's a number of problems in just pointing out, in just working with what's gone wrong with the traumagenic needs. More recently, in fact for many decades now, psychological research has tried to look at what defines healthy growth as well as what's gone wrong. Even from the time of Maslow, people have been trying to work out what defines healthy growth. And there are many models around. Today we talk about the 4 A's: attachment, achievement, autonomy, and altruism. as being the defining characteristics of healthy human beings. If you look at the adult developmental research, those themes come up again and again. In child protection services, we've often used this thing called the circle of courage, which is actually an adaptation of Maslow. Just trying to say, healthy human beings of all sorts need belonging and attachment in all cultures, whether it's with peers, with family, with school, with culture. They need a sense of mastery and achievement. They need to be able to do things. Right from Maslow saying you only get esteem by being able to do things, to be able to contribute. Healthy people have autonomy and independence, can make choices, and healthy people also focus on the other, are concerned as much with the group, with the family, with the society, with the culture, as they are with themselves. So it's my belief that all our services should not just be focusing on what has gone wrong, on the traumagenic needs. I think actually the primary focus should be on normal, universal, and developmental needs. And then, of course, there's a third set of needs. Some of our clients come with individualised conditions that we also need to address. But I've got the little notice here, so I'm just going to skip over here to my final observation from someone you've probably heard of before, Maya Angelou, who's one of, I think, the more compelling writers that we've lost in the last few years. I'll just say this, I think that trauma theory is a compelling framework to be working from, especially with our diverse clients in child and family services. There are some problems in the way it's being promoted, and in some of the things the framework itself has to tackle. But it has brought an unprecedented level of enthusiasm. And I think we need to ride that wave of enthusiasm because the research is suggesting it really is a profound contributor to the issues and the challenges that we face today. It faces there are some exaggerated claims, but I believe that in the next few years that'll settle down and that it'll find its place, I guess, within the pantheon of theoretical perspectives, and it'll be a prominent one in my view. So Maya Angelou, as you know, was herself a victim of a pretty traumatic childhood. Very compelling if you've read some of her biographies, and she's got a whole bunch of them. She had a particularly harrowing experience when she was about 5 years old, I think it was, 5 or 8, if I remember rightly. An abusive experience, which was a shattering experience for her, which led to her not speaking for 5 years. Such an overwhelming experience. But she eventually found her voice, and what a voice it was when she found it. And she's one of those that suggests that the experience of trauma has to be faced, but there's no reason why we can't break the chains of that, why the cycle can't be broken. And I'd just like this to leave you today with this lovely observation from Maya Angelou on the reality of trauma, but also the hope that it can change. So she leaves us with this, that history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Thank you for your time.
Howard, thank you so much for that very rich presentation and sharing of your clinical wisdom, your research knowledge, and I think also you've invited us to think a bit differently about the trauma framework itself, both its applications and perhaps its limits in different settings. So I think, unfortunately, we're right on time, so I'm sure there's lots of questions, but you're around at morning tea, and so can people come and approach you with a question? Look, would you please accept this small gift of appreciation from us, Howard? And could we please give a big round of applause for Howard? Thank you.